Hello everyone. So I'm going to go over just a quick introductory to camera basics. So just to give you an idea of how your camera works and how the camera has evolved. So you may recognize a camera like this, which is a film camera. The mechanics of the film camera compared to the digital cameras that we have now or the SLR cameras that I recommend that you have for this class are super similar, surprisingly, except for that obviously this camera right here uses film and your SLR camera uses computer chip to read those images, so there's no need to have film. So you'll see right in the middle of this picture there is a mirror, and it will open and shut, which we're talking about the shutter speed, and that's another lesson specifically on the shutter speed. But that little guy, if you ever find a camera like this, you can play around with it by clicking the button at the top. You'll see the button at the top left of this image when you're holding it, it's top right. And you can look inside and you'll see it flop. And that's the biggest difference between a film camera and a digital camera, is that little guy inside is replaced with a computer chip that reads it rather than a simple mirror and film. So another similarity to old cameras versus new cameras is that they both have very similar mechanics as far as the aperture. So this is what the aperture looks like when it is really small or the measurement is really large. So whenever we measure the aperture, the number is measuring between the edge of that hole that you see there in the center and the edge of the lens. So for this specific one, it's probably f22, f-stop 22, and it's measuring the millimeters between the edge of that hole there you see in the center and the edge of the lens. And it just depends on what kind of lens you're using in order for that to look a specific way. So another similar thing that we have between old cameras and new cameras is the speed. So a lot of times when you got film, you had a speed. This one's 400. There are a lot of similarities between the speed and the ISO, which I also talk about more specifically. So the ISO is referring to how quickly your camera can gather that image. And for film, it's how quickly the film can respond to the light. So the higher the number, the better the response. But with your SLR camera, the higher number, also the grainier. So here's an example of a chip, what a chip looks like inside of a digital camera. Like I said, that's what makes the difference between SLR digital cameras or point-and-shoot digital cameras and film cameras. So your camera might look a little bit like this, depending on what you have. There are a lot of functions. Just so you know, please don't be intimidated by all of those buttons. There are actually duplicate buttons here. So if you click on the menu of your camera, you'll see all of the options, almost all of the options that you see in physical form. So your menu has a way to get to all of those buttons that you can physically push. But the buttons are there for you to, speed up your process, so you can, quickly, you'll see there on the left where it says RAW and JPEG, you can quickly change your file format, or you can quickly change your ISO, that kind of thing. So, and then it also, when you're taking a picture, you have a lot of information on the screen just to remind you of what all your settings are on, and that gives you kind of a quick view to make sure that your ISO isn't turned up super high when it's bright outside, etc. And then also SLR cameras have a really great autofocus feature for most of them. So you'll see in this specific image, you see the white box. That is the camera is picking up on specific movement. Some cameras are really great at facial recognition. So it will focus on whatever the robot inside thinks it needs to focus on. However, I personally use manual focus quite a bit still because obviously the camera can't predict everything that I want to take a picture of. So manual focus allows me to completely control what I'm focusing on. So here's an example of a photograph using a slow shutter speed. Just so you know, if you've ever seen these like really pretty pictures with the light smearing across the image, it is a very low shutter speed. So what happened here was that the aperture was probably pretty small, like what you saw in the image before, which means it didn't let a lot of light in, and then it's also nighttime, so it's pretty dark, and the shutter was left on for as long as it takes for those cars to go from one side of the bridge to the other, probably. So you'll notice that on the right side in the lane, it's red, which is because the tail lights of cars are red, and then on the other side it is white because the front headlights are normally white. So instead of seeing any of these cars, it looks empty, right? Which is kind of interesting. It looks like an empty landscape. So because the cars were moving, the light was smeared onto the image, and it gives this appearance of this emptiness. There possibly were other people walking around. You can see at the bottom of the frame there's one person standing, and that means that that person was standing there for the entire duration of the shutter being open. So pretty interesting kind of way to take nighttime photos, especially you can capture some of that light that you wouldn't be able to if your camera was just on a normal setting, like the church in the background and the street lights are really bright, and you can even see some of the city behind the bridge where it's lighting up the sky. And you'll notice at the top where it's the sky is right at the edge of the top, you'll see some blank space, and you'll notice that there's some grain in there, right? That means the ISO was up fairly high, so that black sky turned into kind of like a navy grainy look, which is very editable, easily editable if someone wanted to mask just the sky out and turn that back to black. One thing that in this picture here is that it's impossible to take this picture just holding your camera in your hand. You'll need to have something steady like a tripod. I personally don't really care for tripods that much. I mean, I have one, but if I can find an object to set it on, or I've even have one of those like little flexible tripods that you can wrap around a tree limb kind of thing, I will do that rather than carrying one of these big tripods. But tripods are really handy for these kind of nighttime photos because if your camera is moving, it's just like that car. It's going to make the entire image blurry and it won't work. Here's another example of a slow shutter speed with water. I'm sure you've seen, this kind of look before. It kind of looks almost like smoke. Gives it a really smooth look, and all of that. The only technique that's used here is the slow shutter speed. So the only thing that's moving in this picture is the water. Therefore, everything else is clear, and the water is smeared onto the image. And then in contrast to a slow shutter speed, we have situations where a very, very fast shutter speed is needed. And a lot of times these very quick, like split-second moments are the easiest to capture when we have a lot of light. So this specific image, you can tell it's on a fairly well-lit day. Even if it is a little bit overcast, you can tell by the shadow. And you can tell that it is probably midday because the shadow is directly under him. If it isn't during the day, I'm pretty sure just based on the color of the light, it's during the day. That's one reason why fields are well lit, so well lit. So if you're ever trying to take a split-second photo like this one, you'll need quite a bit of light because the shutter speed has to open and close extremely fast. So, you might not even hear it open. It's just like click, click, so quick. And that's how it was able to capture this, like, frozen in time moment where the football player is kind of up in the air and only has his right hand down. The same here, in contrast to the water, you saw the waterfalls. This was a glass where somebody dropped, I guess it's like a peach or an orange, down into it, and the shutter speed was on crazy fast, so you could see this split. You probably didn't even see it with your eye in real life, kind of split second frame where the water is up in the air. And so here's an example of kind of like the city landscape I mentioned earlier, what it would look like based on the shutter speed. So if the shutter speed is really long, like 15 seconds, so count to 15, the shutter is open, and then after 15 it closes. The longer the shutter is open, the more light that comes in. So the light is kind of bleeding onto your chip, or if you're using film, it's bleeding onto the film. Whereas if the camera only has 1.3 seconds to open, the light isn't captured quite as quickly. Here's a cool example of both using shutter speed and moving the camera. So this specific image was not taken with a tripod. So when the biker, this picture is using a slower shutter speed, not crazy slow because it's pretty bright outside. And as the biker, if you can see me, as the biker is riding by, the camera actually pans with him. So the biker's coming by, and this is me with the camera. It just kind of goes like this as it goes by. And it takes a little bit of practice because you have to keep this bike and this guy in the same part of the frame the entire time. So if you to your camera, this is so hard to explain. To your camera, the background is moving and the biker is not. You're kind of tricking the camera into thinking that the trees and the grass, all of that is moving, but the person on the bike is not because it stays in the same portion of the frame the entire time. If you want to practice this, the easiest way to do this is, get a friend to ride a bike by you, or maybe in traffic, you can see a car going by, you can pan with the car. And the closer you are to them, the harder, because you have to pan so quickly. Whereas this person is probably several feet away and can pan with them a little bit slower. It doesn't have to be so fast. Same with your example. If you wanted to try this technique, this photographer panned with the taxi driver. So according to the camera, because everything else is still except for this car, or fairly still, you're tricking your camera into thinking that the car is still and the background is not. Again, here's an example of what your aperture looks like depending on your settings. So if you have your aperture or your f-stop really on a very, very small number, it'll look like the image, the illustration, the very first illustration. Whereas if you have it on a larger number, it will look more like the right side of this illustration. So the wider, just like your eye, the wider that black part, pretend like the black part is your pupil. The wider your pupil is, the more dilated that area and that black area is, the more light that comes in. And opposite on the very last ones, the less light comes in. Here's another example. You can see f-stop 1.4. It's very small. Most lenses will not go down that far. That's one of my favorite lenses that goes down to 1.4 or 1.8. It's a little bit more difficult to focus, but you can get that like really nice depth of field, and it lets in a ton of light. So when you have situations where it's really dark, you don't have to worry about using a tripod as often, and you know, the image comes out fairly clear without having to up your ISO. Here's another example of what that looks like. And then not only does it let more light in, but it also gives a different depth of field. So the picture on the left is using a higher f-stop, so maybe, I'm going to guess, just looking at it, probably f8 or f5.6, something like that. And then the photo on the right is using a much smaller f-stop, like 1.4, f-stop 2, one of those. So the wider your aperture is, the larger depth of field you get. So it looks, you know, you can see the bench looks clear. The bench and the grass look clear on the left, and just the bench looks clear on the right. Here's an example of different ISOs. The image at the top has a lower ISO, so possibly, depending on your camera, all cameras are different as far as ISO. I can't just look at it and, you know, guess, but I'm just going to guess the ISO at the top is about 200, the ISO at the bottom is somewhere around like 1600. So you can see how the ISO is different. If you are in a really dark situation, upping the ISO will let in more light, but it will also make it grainy like the bottom one. Another thing that you'll need to know is what full frame means. So full frame is referring to this very top image. All film cameras are full frame, whereas now that we have computer chips, the chips can only see part of the frame, and the nicer your camera is, the more, you know, the bigger that gray square is. So you can see some examples of different frames. If you have a Canon, you're probably going to be in the second row down, one of those, unless you have a full frame camera. Most full frame camera bodies can be, I mean, at the cheapest, $1,500, because it gives you so much more space to work with your frame. And one thing to remember too is that if you do get a full frame camera, some of the lenses that work for, it's called a cropped sensor. Everything below that gray square at the top is considered cropped sensor. Those lenses for crop sensor cameras do not work with full frame cameras. I'm a big fan of full frame and will probably always have a camera that's full frame. So here's an example of possibly a camera you have on the left versus a camera that, you know, kind of your dream camera. My dream camera over here to the right, which we have a few of these. This is the one on the right. It's an older version, but just to give you a sense, you see in the middle that frame, that computer chip is much smaller on the left compared to the right. So you have quite a bit more of a frame option with the nicer cameras. Here's another example of like what it would look like with a crop sensor versus a full frame sensor. And another one. So one thing that you'll need to keep in mind when you're taking a picture is to hold your camera well. It's kind of like, you know, if you've ever done any kind of music lessons, there's a way that you put your hand on the piano or a way to hold the violin. This example, or this photograph, is a good example of how you should hold your camera. So once you get into nicer cameras, you're going to have lenses that are heavier, and you're going to be really fluent in doing manual focus. So you'll want to have, you know, depending on, you'll want to have your left hand on the lens and your right hand over on the side, because that's where most of your main functions are. If you use manual, that this girl's right thumb is on a dial that will adjust the aperture, or I'm sorry, the shutter speed, and her right finger will not only take the picture but also adjust. There's another dial for aperture. Here's another example, and this is kind of out of order, but another, just to show you an example of shutter speed. This fan is going on the same speed for every single photo, but you can see how the slower the shutter speed at 1/8 of a second versus the faster at 1/1000th of a second looks much different. So I'm glad that we are together, and welcome to photojournalism and getting used to your camera. And I just encourage you to just take lots of pictures, put it on all settings. You're not going to break it. Don't worry about breaking it. You're not going to do anything wrong. Just go for it. And I look forward to seeing all of your images.